A Libert Seguros agora é Yellon. Tudo aquilo que já era bom continua igual. Excelência e proximidade permanecem como nossa essência. Porque não é uma mudança, é uma evolução. A Yellon está sempre em sintonia com você. É liberdade com segurança. A melhor experiência acessível a todos os clientes, iluminando cada passo da sua jornada. Deixe essa luz iluminar seu caminho. Yellon Seguradora. Seguro para viver livre. Consulte seu corretor.
Today on CityCast DC, we are talking about the not-so-big fallout from the local election and the pretty big fallout in DC from the national one. And we also have some hope, or maybe some cope, at the end. I'm here with my CityCast colleague Priyanka Tilve and the Washington Post's Meagan Flynn. Today is Friday, November 8th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Priyanka.
Hey there.
Hey, Meagan.
Hey, Mike. It's going.
Good. So you are a city reporter, which means you got to cover not the national election, but the local one, where maybe the most exciting thing on the ballot was Initiative 83, which provides for ranked choice votings and changes who can vote in primaries. How'd it go down? It won. How big did it win?
It passed overwhelmingly, with roughly 3/4 of voters supporting it. And that was the type of margin that the proponents were hoping for, because its passage doesn't make these changes to the election automatic. The DC Council is still going to have to debate it and appropriate funds for it before it goes into effect.
So I understand it. When you pass an initiative, it becomes law, but it doesn't appropriate any money for it. Does this mean that the council is obliged to appropriate money for it?
Well, this was a bit of a different type of ballot initiative than historically what we've seen. Historically, to be a ballot initiative, it cannot have a fiscal impact. But what the leaders of the ballot initiative did was they added this language that was like, subject to appropriations, this is what will happen. And that language is what leaves this up to the council to decide, do we have money for this? Or do we not? And considering, the mayor hinted at this last week, that, well, considering many competing priorities, I can't guarantee that I'll see this as a priority. And so it does leave it a bit of an open question as to whether the council will follow through. But the reason I mentioned that margin being for proponents, what they were looking for was that they're going to basically go to the council and say, I hope that you respect the will of the voters. And that's the type of margin that's pretty decisive.
Is this expected to cost a lot? Like, what would the money need to be set aside for?
So the chief financial officer did do a bit of a fiscal impact and projected about $1.5 million over 4 years.
Wait, what does that go for? I mean, I guess you need someone's time to draft the instructions for how people can vote this way?
What you really need is a voter outreach campaign, because people need to understand how this works, and it won't be natural for people just showing up at the polls. And so a lot of the money would be for, like, the Board of Elections doing voter outreach on ranked choice voting. They'd also, they might have to have some changes to their equipment. They might need more staff. That seems like kind of a preliminary figure. I'm not sure if there, will be more of a deeper analysis moving forward. But for now, that was the initial projection.
The voter outreach part of it especially seems critical. I wonder if they might be able to tap into volunteers for that too. Like, if more than 70% of the city wants this to be a thing, maybe there's people out there that would be willing to help. And I hope they consider those options when determining whether or not to push ahead with this.
Historically, the voter initiatives tend to pass in D.C. Has the council historically respected them?
Well, so what's new about this situation is the fiscal impact part of it. That does make this a bit of an unprecedented situation. However, like, people point to all of the changes with the I-82 as like an example.
Which was the elimination of the tip minimum wage.
Yeah. And the council just kind of constantly legislating on this, going back on things. And so there is like a role for the council sometimes. So that part is not unprecedented. But the council was, particularly Phil Mendelson, very mad, very opposed, Phil Mendelson, to Initiative 83 and found it to be like kind of a trick to add this subject to appropriations language. He has put forward legislation that would prohibit that from ever being the case for a ballot initiative ever again, so that you can only do a ballot initiative if it doesn't have a fiscal impact. So they're not happy, particularly Phil Mendelson, not happy about that. There's other council members who, they've been a bit cryptic about their stance on Initiative 83. Only a couple have really fully said, I absolutely support it and will fund it. Others, I think, they say, oh, well, kind of across that bridge when we get there tech. And so it remains to be seen how they'll legislate on it.
Wait, so the fiscal thing seems like your classic, nitpicking. You're sort of take some sort of more arcane piece of something to oppose because you don't want to admit that what you're really against is actually changing the rules of elections that you have successfully navigated in the past.
Oh, no, he's also very openly, specifically also opposed to ranked choice voting as well as, and the mayor as well, both very opposed to ranked choice voting and allowing independents to vote in the primary elections. The Democratic Party really pushed back on that, saying, if you want to vote in our primary, register with our party. Proponents say they're taxpayer-funded elections. And so if you're a taxpayer, you should be allowed to participate regardless of your party or your lack of party. And on ranked choice voting, it's certainly just a disagreement on whether that method is going to improve our elections, particularly this issue that proponents have described and is not infrequent in our elections, where the winner of the election does not have a majority of the vote, particularly in crowded primaries or very crowded at-large races like we saw in 2020. And that's what ranked choice voting is intended to address.
I know some of the council members had been vocal about the fact that they supported ranked choice voting, but not open primaries or vice versa. Is it possible that they could fund one and not the other?
That's a really great question. And I think the difficulty of this initiative was it was two distinct questions on one ballot initiative. A lot of voters didn't like that. A lot of city leaders didn't like that. They thought those should be separate and that, especially if you support one and not the other. And the ballot initiative just said at the end, subject to appropriations. It didn't say for each individual item subject to appropriations. So to be honest, I am not 100% sure how that would work. Although most of this fiscal impact that we're talking about is related to ranked choice voting and not to the independents, although there might be a minor impact on the Board of Elections to make that possible for them. And so I think that's a great question, and I think we'll definitely see that as being part of the debate in council.
So this general issue, ranked choice voting, really got its butt kicked across the country. Alaska, where ranked choice voting had led to Sarah Palin's defeat, has ended its ranked choice voting. It lost in a bunch of places, mostly in the West. This is a place where D.C. is an outlier. To what do you attribute that?
Yeah, that was really interesting to see, especially considering, we also had a lot of money from, national advocacy groups that supported it here. They really went all in these other states, really. And so what I've understood about it, I didn't cover the initiatives in those states, but from what I see so far, it looks like a lot of the more rural parts of those states just really opposed it more aggressively than people were supporting it, maybe in bluer areas. In D.C. being as blue as it is, we didn't see, it's actually flip-flopped. Here it was the Democratic Party who's really against it, but just not quite influential enough, especially up against a very well-funded campaign. Did that seem to deter enough people, even though 3/4 of our voters here belong to the party who are registered. And so that was an interesting thing to see. But in those states, it definitely seemed to be the redder parts of the states that ended up leading to the failure of those initiatives.
It seems to me there's actually a bit of continuity there because, in those states, it was the college-educated parts of the state that supported it. And listening to the tenor of our debate that we had on CityCast about this, it was the vote no on 83 forces were very much painting Initiative 83, rightly or wrongly, as a thing that was going to discriminate against less educated voters in D.C. So, in D.C., those less educated voters may also happen to be Democrats, but it seems like more of a highbrow, lowbrow divide than a red-blue one.
There was a huge part of the debate is that this will hurt more marginalized voters where we already have a turnout problem. And that making the system more complicated would just further, create another hurdle. That was absolutely a main argument from opponents, and who argued it would tip the scales, I think was language they used, to more wealthier parts of the district and give them essentially more influence in elections. They also happen to be whiter parts of the district. And so, that made the debate really sensitive, as proponents were saying, like, well, what do you mean? Are you saying that they're going to be less likely to understand ranked choice voting? And it was, some of them found it very insulting. And so those debates would grow quite heated at a lot of the forums. And there was a lot of voter forums on this. That was something both campaigns did really well and were very committed to in so many parts of the district. But it absolutely, that was a big part of the opposition campaign, was this concern about its impact on, lower income or less education. Those types of voters, are they going to be excited about this, or are they going to say, why are you changing it? And a lot of people, regardless of education level, wealth, or anything, that was a question. It was like, why are we changing it? Ultimately, though, 73% of people were down to change it.
Aqui no Spotify, muitas playlists são criadas através de inteligência artificial. A IA está em todo lugar, mas nem todo IA é igual. Desbloqueie experiências de IA mais inteligentes, fáceis de expandir e personalizadas para sua vida e seus negócios com os computadores Lenovo e processadores Intel Core Ultra, que transformam a sua experiência tecnológica. Acesse lenovo.com/smarter. Lenovo, inteligência artificial mais inteligente para todos.
Estou passando nesse podcast para dividir uma informação que fez toda a diferença na minha vida. Quer fazer pós-graduação, mas tá impossível correr de um lugar para o outro?
Pois é, ainda mais com o trânsito.
Então você precisa conhecer a educação à distância do Senac. Sabia que é nota máxima no MEC? E tem diversos cursos de pós-graduação para te levar ainda mais longe. 100% online, sem necessidade de TCC e com acesso direto a todos os professores.
Ah, saber isso fez diferença sim.
Inscreva-se já na pós-graduação EAD. Quer saber? Senac EAD.
So speaking of places where D.C. Was an outlier to the rest of the country, there was a presidential election this week, and Donald Trump won. This was not the preference of the great majority of voters within the district and Maryland and Virginia, and particularly the D.C. suburban parts of those states. What was the vibe like around town? Were you guys out Tuesday night or Wednesday?
Yeah, I was in 7 and 8 on Tuesday, and really, I heard a lot of optimism, but also a lot of anxiety. I'll admit, I was definitely just really interested in what people had to say about our local races, and probably more so, but there was this sort of excitement, that cautious optimism.
And how about afterwards?
Oh, afterwards, it just seemed quiet out there, just sort of.
The city seemed dead yesterday.
Yeah.
It was so eerie.
Still, it felt a little different to me than 2016, where people really, were in shock. It was after 9/11 or something. And this felt more like a sort of sorrow.
It was grief. It felt like resignation and grief to me on the streets. I felt like everyone was just walking around zoned out. I went for a couple walks yesterday, and I just feel like, given how beautiful the weather was, it was not that many people, not as many people as I'm used to seeing out on the streets. And yeah, just subdued.
So I think one of the things that a lot of people have on their minds is what I wrote my political column on this week, which you all should read because it's really good, is it's every time there's a new president, or in this case, a returning new president, there's this sort of, how will it change DC? And the answer, in my experience, is typically not very much. That the policies of the federal government might change, but the way we live, work, play is more or less the same. Our city has developed in the last half century into a pretty typical blue American big city. I think there's a lot of concern, and I certainly share it, that actually this time could really be different. And, probably foremost on a lot of people's minds, I think, is Trump's efforts at the end of his first administration and his much more explicit plans for the second to, reclassify and fire a lot of public servants, which has, not ever been part of the deal. If you are a public servant, and I think most people really, 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 live this, you serve the people your fellow citizens have elected, and you serve them in each party and so on. But there's plans to, fire huge numbers of them and or ship large numbers of them out of D.C., which has sort of, seems to me, two impacts. One is, on a personal level, this is a city where a lot of people, particularly people who move here from afar, they really, they come for their work. They're not coming for the weather. And their professional identity means a lot to them. So the idea that you are a person who prides yourself on whatever wonky expertise you have developed in the federal bureaucracy, and suddenly you are treated or expected to be a partisan political hack, that's a pretty devastating thing, even if you don't get fired. And then the other thing is there's a lot of reasons why it might not happen, but if they really do succeed at pushing large numbers of federal workers either out of their jobs or out of the region, that actually, it's like a factory closing in a town. If you own a house and you've sunk a lot of your wealth into it and you expect the value to appreciate, this could be a dangerous thing for the sort of regional economy. I think both these things are, this is not the kind of devious, let's pass a law in DC saying such and such, which is also on a lot of people's minds. But this is a much more sort of, it's the thing that is going to matter to you, even if you don't care about whatever the DC council's up to at any given moment.
Yeah, it'll change the culture of the city at a very base level.
There's a lot of people who move here because they're interested in a profession that happens to focus on the nation or the world, and they don't really take the time to get that involved in their city because they sort of assume it'll just go along of its own devices. This time, again, I think some of the agenda items for the Republican Party vis-a-vis DC are things that usually there's a lot of fuss about it, but it's stuff that hits a rather small proportion of the population. Like if you don't have health insurance and need an abortion, or if you're participating in needle exchange. These were the kinds of things they targeted in the past, which are, devastating for the people who need them, but they're not a sort of everyone thing. But the stuff, they could quite easily just legislate away abortion rights in the district. Big deal. There's all this crazy stuff in Project 2025. One of the things says the president asserts that the president has inherent authority over schools in DC and should immediately ban critical race theory and the use of pronouns other than the one you were born with without parental written consent, which is that's really deep in the weeds, but it's also stuff that a lot of people who work in politics or journalism or whatever and don't really think about the hometown are suddenly going to find that wow, my kids are affected by that.
Right. Yeah. And I think that the granularity of some of his threats have been really among the most concerning things, as you noted. It's kind of one of those things where there's this question right now about rhetoric versus follow through and the federal takeover that he's threatened. What does that mean, right? And I think some of these impacts on the federal workers who are families in our region who, work for the federal government, many in D.C. or around D.C., absolutely, it's a very, very real impact on what to do, what he plans to do to the federal workforce. The threats on D.C. specifically, he speaks as if he has an unfettered power over the district. Of course, that isn't the case necessarily, but the rhetoric itself is what's concerning when you see, if you have a Republican Congress that might entertain at least sort of the base level of what is behind the threats. And that could be on some of the school vouchers, right? Some of these things that we already have a structure for, that in Congress right now, there's been just a significantly increased appetite for legislating on some of those things. And it makes it a lot easier if you have Trump in the White House. But things I've heard the Financial Control Board coming back. I've also heard, a lot of skepticism that that's really even on the table when it's not as easy as snapping your fingers. It requires a lot more. There's a lot more that would need to be triggered. And so I've heard, some concerns there. And I think that's one area where maybe it's not that simple for Trump to do something like that.
There's 3 MAGA members of Congress who had proposed to end home rule.
It's the combination of rhetoric from Trump on a takeover and that type of action in Congress that makes people really nervous. At the end of the day, though, something like the Senate filibuster, which we hear, a lot of, when we're in the statehood context, like, oh, if the Senate filibuster wasn't here, we could be a state. But in this case, that's actually something that's the district's friend in a situation like this, where something as, radical as abolishing DC's local government, that would be very difficult to push through in Congress, even if Trump was behind it. Because it'd be really hard to do. Like, they have no, that legislation has absolutely no contemplation on how Congress would run the government. And, what would we be going back to? Have you even thought of, how you'd run our affairs? Like, it's way harder and it's very easy to do or to talk about politically, a lot harder to do in practice.
So before 1973, there were 3 federal commissioners who ran the city, different components of it. No votes, no one voted to choose them. And I've actually seen, like, somewhere in, like, the, bogs of social media, someone on the right trying to mount a defense of this, that, like, there should be, like in the colonies, there should be a governor general appointed to boss around the natives and show them the true values. Which is just to say, like, once you get into people kind of trying to mount quasi-intellectual defenses of things, it starts to feel pretty real, even if, like, the ideas seem far-fetched.
Absolutely. And then there's also the things that Trump would be able to do that would not require any cooperation from Congress or any sort of votes. Things like he could temporarily take over the local police department, which, obviously he's spoken out a lot about how he hates the way we protest in DC. In 2016, right after, or I guess in 2017, right after he was inaugurated, there were so many protests here, like on a daily or weekly basis. Would he use his temporary control of MPD to squash those? I mean, that would, again, significantly change the culture of the city.
For whatever it's worth, I think there's not going to be those protests this time. I think people are exhausted. I think people don't have the, like, this was a fluke, or the Russians did this, or Comey did this. I think it's like, I think a lot of people are going to read this as, dude, a majority of our fellow citizens have chosen this. And it's like, for people who feel strongly the other way, it's a gut punch. But there's also a lot of people who went out who are going to think, like, what was the point of all that going out to protest? That's my hunch. People have a sort of fight or flight, and fight kicked in after 2016. I think it's going to be flight this time. Like, the stakes are a lot lower, but there's an example from last time. In DC, under the rules governing the city, the feds, the president, get a great say in what the city looks like. So, anything near federal property has to be approved by this Commission of Fine Arts. And historically, it had been filled with the exact same kind of people, whoever was president, and the kind of buildings that got okayed were the exact same, whoever was president. But in Trump's first term, he filled it with people who appointed this very conservative architecture critic who leads an organization devoted to classical architecture and that hates modern architecture, and was out to change the look of federal buildings. I don't know if you like columns or if you like modern buildings, who cares? But, like, it's actually, that is a practical legacy that could be left without any say-so from anyone else.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating thing to be thinking about at a time when our mayor has on her agenda, like, wanting to, for a lot of these federal buildings, like, can the district do something with them and repurpose them and just, like, completely revisualize, like, some of these underused federal buildings? And I think remains to be seen. Like, she struck this very, like, let's kind of work together kind of tone yesterday. I work with all the administrations and this will be no different. And so for some of the federal building questions or federal property, RFK included, I think it's a really big question on the degree to which the Trump administration would be cooperative. One thing they agree on, it seems, is wanting to get federal workers back into the buildings.
Yeah, that's going to be an immediate thing.
Yeah.
Just one thing from the more national elections that I wanted to mention is, I feel like in light of what happened with Trump, there were some, like, wins that people in DC would usually celebrate and didn't, like Angela Alsobrooks winning her Senate seat in Maryland. She is the first Black senator from Maryland and only, I think, the 4th Black female senator ever in the U.S. I feel like that would have been a bigger headline and, like, just bigger news, something to celebrate if the Trump win hadn't overshadowed it. And the other thing is that Maryland enshrined abortion into their state constitution, which I also think people would have celebrated. So just wanted to mention those while we're on the topic of national stuff.
RH, quer saber como voar no trabalho? É só usar a Flash. Com a Flash, você concentra toda a gestão de pessoas em um único lugar. Faça a admissão dos colaboradores e solicite mais de 8 categorias de benefícios. Ah, e você ainda pode fazer todo o controle de ponto. Conheça o novo onboarding integrado da Flash em flashapp.com.br.
Quer desenvolver os talentos da sua equipe e potencializar os resultados da sua empresa? Conte com a expertise do atendimento corporativo do Senac São Paulo, que já capacitou mais de 1 milhão de pessoas e profissionais de instituições públicas, privadas e terceiro setor. Construa uma equipe altamente motivada e capacitada e destaque-se no mercado. Entre em contato, acesse sp.senac.br/corporativo e saiba mais. Quer saber? Senac.
We were thinking this week about like a lot of our neighbors, probably a lot of our listeners, people feeling like awfully, I think there's a kind of griefful vibe for most people in Washington, some not. But we had a conversation about what people do in these moments to kind of center themselves and get their minds straight. Priyanka, you were thinking about this particularly. What are some of the things you thought about?
Yeah, one of my friends yesterday, shout out to Ben, like his initial reaction was to bake banana bread, and then he just walked around to all of his friends' places delivering the banana bread. He made several loaves.
How many bananas did he have in advance?
I'm not sure. I'll get back to you. But it just got me thinking about how at times like these, a lot of people are going to lean into volunteerism. I think we're going to see a surge in people reaching out to volunteer groups. And I also am feeling the pull to go in that direction. I think leaning into your community, leaning into local opportunities to help your neighbors is the only coping mechanism that seems like within reach right now. I don't know if either of you saw that in your communities over the last 48 hours.
I feel like I've been in the newsroom for at least half of those hours.
I think reporters are a very poor cross-section of the population.
That's fair. That's fair. Okay, well, I was looking into it for this chat, and there are the 51st actually, like the new local news organization for people who aren't familiar, they put out a really great list of volunteer opportunities. A few that stood out to me were Lutheran Social Services, Ayuda, and the Immigrant and Refugee Outreach Center, which are all organizations that support, as you would guess, immigrants and refugees in the DMV area. I think that's like a subsection of volunteer groups that's going to see a lot of interest over the next year, because that's one of the things people are concerned about with a Trump presidency. There's also groups like We Defend DC, which is a new collective that is primarily focused on protecting DC from all of the stuff that we were just mentioning. They actually had their first organizing meeting last night, so you've missed that, unfortunately. But if you are interested, you can follow their Instagram page, which is at We Defend DC, to get involved going forward. There's also like a lot of organizations in the area that focus on housing. Remora House, Thrive DC. There's groups that focus on providing food for people, Feed the People DC, Food Not Bombs, Bread for the City. If you're interested in like giving back or finding community through volunteerism, these are all really good groups to find. I also think that like you can get involved by like attending ANC meetings to, again, lean into your local community and see how you can focus on something that you have control over, I suppose. And then there was a really, really great Washingtonian piece that came out last night, which I was very grateful to find, that talks about a bunch of deals that you can kind of lean into from local places. For example, the bar on U Street called Bunker, which is like a primarily LGBTQ plus bar, they're offering $5 shots throughout the weekend, and then the proceeds of that will go to the ACLU. There's a massage place in Silver Spring called Rainbow Spring Wellness that's giving 50% off a specific type of massage if you book using the code ELECTION. They're doing that all month long. And then there's this crafting bar/cafe in Tacoma Park called Mary Pin that's going to be doing a lot of like community events for people. And so they're doing one called the Mini Quilting Bee on Friday. And part of their like Eventbrite listing for this talked about how this is a safe place for people to come and like coexist. There's also a cry in public event at Southwest Library on Tuesday if you're looking to cry in community.
I feel like the last one is like a parody of Blue Cities. Sorry.
A little bit. I can see that.
I'm waiting for the Portlandia episode.
At my college, I think it was like the day before finals started or something, we did the primal scream. So it was like at 9 p.m., the whole school just like guttural shouted. And it was very cathartic to do that together. So maybe that's the vibe they're going for. This crying event was also planned before the election, I should say.
Like a just in case cry, or?
Yeah, I guess so. It must be. The listing doesn't say anything about the election. It just so happens to be a week after the election.
Any reason.
Yes. Go cry about anything you'd like.
That's all those modern buildings in D.C. It brings me to tears.
Of course, you could also lean into any general coping mechanisms, like going outside. The fall colors are beautiful. A lot of people are taking that stuff in. So go for a hike this weekend. If you have Veterans Day off on Monday, go camping. These are the things I lean into.
I'll take some advice from you, Priyanka. That sounds really nice. Nice camping trip.
All right, so before we go, I noticed we have shouted out a whole bunch of local journalism today. Priyanka, you mentioned pieces from Washingtonian, from the 51st. Meagan, you're obviously a star of the Washington Post. And I feel like at moments like this, when a lot of people in D.C. feel like the country is out of control and the federal government that they don't control may soon be doing things to their lives, one place people gravitate is towards their community, their local universe, and the people who cover it. It's a long way of saying, please become a member of CityCast.
Yeah, we're really hoping to help provide some solace to our community too.
And news.
And yeah, exactly. Both with like important information that we have vetted and made sure is accurate. And then also, like you've heard today, our authentic perspectives and our recommendations for comfort. And if you feel passionate about our work, if any of what we've provided for you in the lead up to election or since the election has been helpful, like Mike said, please consider becoming a member. It's really easy. You just go to membership.citycast.fm, and we'll also have that link for you in our show notes. And we really hope our election coverage has served you. And if it hasn't, let us know. You can also email us at dc@citycast.fm, and we're really open to hearing your feedback.
And by the way, you get stuff from being a member too. Just to be clear, you get ad-free listening, you get early invites to public events. It's pretty cool.
You also get a members-only events email every Monday to help you plan your week ahead. So we aim to please.
All right, well, Meagan, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
Priyanka, awesome to see you.
Nice to see you too.
And that is all for today here on CityCast DC. Our production team this week was Priyanka Tilve, Julia Karen, Ash Durbin, and Francisco Kilgore. Newsletter editor Kayla Cote-Summerman wrote our fabulous newsletter, Hey DC, this week. And our hosts are Bridget Todd and me, Michael Schaefer from Politico. Music is by Alex Roldan. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell the person next to you at your next public crying event? We'll be back Monday morning with more